The Ark of the Covenant was a really big deal. It was more than just a box. It was the most important thing for the ancient Israelites. Think of it as the center of their whole world with God. It connected them to God in a way nothing else did. This wasn't just some religious relic. It was a powerful symbol, a sacred object, and a constant reminder of who God was and what he meant to them. First off, what was it? It was a chest. A special chest. God told Moses exactly how to make it when the Israelites were at Mount Sinai. He gave very specific instructions. It was made of acacia wood. This wood was common in the desert. Then it was covered inside and out with pure gold. Imagine that. A wooden box, totally covered in shining gold. It was not huge, not something you needed a big truck for. It was about 4 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and 2.5 feet high. So, big enough to carry, but definitely weighty because of all that gold. On top of the ark, there was a lid. This lid was also made of pure gold. It was called the mercy seat. The Hebrew word for it is kaparet. This word is related to kofar, which means to atone or to cover. So right there, the name tells you something very important about its purpose. And on this mercy seat, there were 2 figures, 2 cherubim. These were golden statues facing each other with their wings spread out, covering the mercy seat. Their faces were looking down at the mercy seat. This was all part of God's detailed plan. He didn't leave anything to chance. Every part had a meaning. Now, why was this golden box so important? Its main significance was that it represented God's presence among his people. Well, God himself said, "There I will meet with you." This wasn't just a nice idea. This was real. God, the creator of everything, chose to put his presence, his dwelling place, in a very specific spot, right over that mercy seat between the 2 cherubim. When the Israelites looked at the ark, they weren't seeing God himself, because God is spirit and cannot be seen. But they were seeing the chosen place where God promised to be with them. It was a tangible sign of an invisible God. Think about what that meant for people wandering in the desert. They were nomads. They had left slavery in Egypt. They were heading to a promised land they had never seen. They were vulnerable. They faced enemies. They had no real home. But they had the ark. And with the ark, they had God's presence. It was their assurance. It was their comfort. It was their strength. When they moved, the ark moved with them. When they camped, the ark was set up in the special tent, the tabernacle, in the holiest part. God was literally with them every step of the way. The ark also represented God's covenant with Israel. What's a covenant? It's like a special agreement, a solemn promise. God made a covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. He promised to be their God, and they promised to be his people and obey his laws. The very name of the Ark of the Covenant, tells you this. Inside the Ark, God commanded Moses to place the 2 stone tablets. These tablets had the 10 Commandments written on them. These were not just suggestions. These were the very words of God, the foundation of their covenant with him. So, the Ark didn't just hold his presence, it held his word, his law, his agreement. It was a storage box for the most sacred documents of their relationship with God. Later, Aaron's staff, which had budded, was also put in the ark, and a pot of manna, the special food God provided in the desert. These items served as reminders. The manna reminded them of God's provision. Aaron's staff reminded them of God's chosen priesthood, but the stone tablets were always the main thing. They were the core of the covenant. The ark, then, was a constant physical symbol of this unique bond between God and Israel. It was a daily, visible sign of their special chosen status, and because it was God's presence and held his covenant, the ark was a source of incredible power. It wasn't magic, not like some charm, but God worked through it, showing his power to his people and to their enemies. We see this right from the start. When the Israelites were moving through the wilderness, the ark often went ahead of them. It was like God was scouting the way, leading them directly. It wasn't just a banner. It was their divine guide. The cloud of God's presence hovered over it, guiding them by day, and a pillar of fire by night. This was a visible sign to everyone. Remember the story of crossing the Jordan River. The Israelites were finally at the edge of the Promised Land, but the Jordan River was at flood stage. It was impossible to cross with so many people. What did God command? He told the priests to carry the ark into the river. And the moment their feet touched the water stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap upstream, and the riverbed became dry ground. The people walked across on dry land. This was a huge miracle, a direct display of God's power through the ark. It showed them, and the Canaanites on the other side, that their God was mighty and faithful to his promises. The ark was at the center of this incredible event. Then there was the Battle of Jericho, a famous story. Jericho had strong, thick walls. It seemed impossible to conquer, but God had a plan. He told the Israelites to march around the city once a day for 6 days. And on the seventh day, they were to march 7 times, and then the priests would blow trumpets, and the people would shout. And guess what was at the front of this procession? The Ark of the Covenant, carried by the priests. It led the way. It was the visible symbol of God's presence leading the charge. And when they shouted, the walls of Jericho fell flat. This was not human strength. This was God's power demonstrated again with the ark as the centerpiece. It showed that God fought their battles. He delivered their victories. But the ark wasn't just about victory and leading the way. It also showed God's judgment and holiness. This is a very important part of its significance. The ark was intensely holy. It wasn't something to be treated casually. It demanded extreme reverence and strict adherence to God's commands about how it should be handled. God is holy, and anything connected directly to his presence is also holy. Think about Uzzah. This is a very sobering story. David was bringing the ark back to Jerusalem, a good intention. But they were moving it on a new cart, not by carrying it on poles as God had commanded. The oxen stumbled, and the ark started to tip. Uzzah reached out his hand to steady it. He meant well, maybe, but God struck him down, and he died right there. Why? Because God had explicitly said no one was to touch the ark, except for very specific Levites, and even then, only by the poles. Uzzah violated God's command regarding the ark's holiness. This was a stark reminder that God's holiness is not to be trifled with. You can't just decide to do things your own way with something so sacred. The ark was a physical representation of God's holy standards. Then there's the time the Philistines captured the ark. The Israelites got complacent, and they thought of the ark like a lucky charm. They brought it into battle thinking it would guarantee victory even though their hearts weren't right with God. And they lost. The Philistines captured the ark. This must have been devastating for Israel. But God showed his power even when the ark was among his enemies. The Philistines took the ark to their temple, and they set it next to their god Dagon. The next morning, Dagon's statue had fallen on its face before the ark. They put it back up. The next morning, Dagon had fallen again, and this time its head and hands had broken off. It was clear who the true God was, but the Philistines also suffered. Plagues broke out in their cities where the ark was kept. Tumors, death. They moved the ark from city to city, and each city was afflicted. They realized they couldn't keep it. It was too powerful, too holy. It brought judgment on them because they were not God's people, and they treated it like a trophy. So they decided to send it back to Israel. Even when the ark came back to Israel, people still didn't understand its holiness fully. The people of Beth Shemesh were overjoyed when it returned, but some of them made a terrible mistake. They looked inside the ark. God had strictly forbidden anyone from looking into it, and because they did, many of them died. Again, a severe judgment. These events hammered home a crucial lesson. The ark was not just a symbol of God's presence and power, but also a symbol of his absolute holiness and the strict obedience he demanded. It was a dangerous thing if treated without reverence. The ark also played a central role in Israel's worship, especially in the tabernacle and later the temple. It was the focal point. It lived in the holiest part of the tabernacle, a room called the Most Holy Place or the Holy of Holies. This room was separated from the rest of the tabernacle by a thick veil. Only the high priest was allowed to enter this room, and only once a year. That once-a-year event was the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. This was the most solemn day in the Israelite calendar. On this day, the high priest would take the blood of a sacrificed bull and a goat. He would enter the Holy of Holies. He would sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat of the ark. This act was for the atonement of the sins of the high priest, his family, and all the people of Israel. The blood represented life given in place of sinful lives, and the mercy seat was the place where God's mercy met with justice. It was where the sins were covered for another year. Without the ark, without the mercy seat, this most vital act of national forgiveness could not happen. The ark was essential for their ongoing relationship with a holy God. It showed how serious sin was and how gracious God was to provide a way for atonement. The way the ark was handled was also very specific. It was carried on poles by specific members of the Levite tribe, the Kohathites. It was always covered when it was moved. No one was to touch it directly. This wasn't just ceremonial law for the sake of it. It was to protect the people and to show the extreme reverence required for God's holy dwelling place. The constant care, the strict rules, the special caring, all of it underscored the ark's incredible significance as the place where God chose to dwell among them. For centuries, the ark remained the central point of Israel's worship and their national identity. When the tabernacle was replaced by Solomon's temple, the ark was moved into the Holy of Holies in the temple. It was still the most sacred object, the visible heart of their relationship with God. The temple was built around it. Everything revolved around the fact that God had chosen to dwell there, above the ark. But then, the ark disappears from the biblical record. After the time of the kings, especially around the Babylonian exile, it is no longer mentioned. Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 16 even talks about a future time when people won't say, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, or miss it, or make another one. This is a profound statement. It suggests that while the Ark was essential for the Old Covenant, it wouldn't be necessary forever. Something else, something greater would come. This leads us to a deeper understanding looking forward through the Bible. In the New Testament, the book of Hebrews connects the Ark and its rituals to Jesus Christ. The earthly tabernacle with its Holy of Holies and the mercy seat was a shadow. It was a copy of a heavenly reality. Jesus, in the New Testament, is presented as the ultimate high priest. He entered the true Holy of Holies, which is heaven itself, and he didn't offer the blood of animals. He offered his own blood, once and for all, as the perfect sacrifice for sins. So the mercy seat on the ark, where atonement happened yearly, pointed to Jesus. And Jesus became the ultimate mercy seat, the place where God's mercy and justice perfectly meet through his sacrifice. He is the ultimate fulfillment of what the ark represented. God's presence is no longer limited to a golden box in a tent or a temple. Through Jesus, God's Spirit dwells in believers. The Old Covenant, represented by the Ark and its rituals, paved the way for the New Covenant, where forgiveness is complete and God's presence is more intimately available. The Ark of the Covenant was never God himself. It was never to be worshipped. It was a tool, a symbol, a physical representation that God commanded. It showed people that God was real. He was with them. He was powerful. He was holy. He demanded obedience. He provided a way for atonement. It taught them vital lessons about God's character and their relationship with him. Its story is woven through centuries of Israelite history, from the desert wanderings to the building of the temple. In every way, the Ark of the Covenant signified God's intense engagement with his chosen people. It was the very heart of their worship and national life. It was a constant reminder of God's personal commitment to them. It was a visual aid to help them understand profound spiritual truths. It taught them about God's presence, his covenant, his power, his judgment, and his grace. And eventually, it pointed to a greater reality, a fuller revelation of God's plan for humanity through Jesus. So, while the Ark itself may be lost to history, its significance echoes throughout the entire biblical story, teaching us timeless truths about God's nature and his desire to be in a relationship with people. It truly was, and remains, a profoundly significant object in the story of faith.